Jonathan, with you. When you replay that, what comes to your mind first?
Well, what immediately comes to mind is the first time I viewed the footage, which was, it was really hard to watch that, and it doesn't get easier, but I get very angry. I liken it to, you know, anybody doing their job getting arrested for doing that job, and I feel that yeah, just a lot of anger. I'm still kind of trying to process everything. I've tried to just avoid as much attention as possible, though I'm glad to be here tonight. I generally like to report the news and not become it. But yeah, and I'm also really thankful to the officer who put the camera back in my pocket.
Yeah, I don't know if he gets a stringer fee or not, but I have to. It was a pretty good move, actually.
Yeah. I've yet to write him a thank you letter, but I'll probably send the THP blanket Christmas cards.
Well, we should note that as of yesterday,
yes,
criminal charges have been dropped.
Criminal charges have been dropped and all citations dismissed. So it's a big win for me and the 54 other people that were arrested, including a student journalist for MTSU.
Right, who was arrested at the same time.
Yeah, the same night.
And with a camera?
She had, yeah, she had a camera around her neck, and she was not as fortunate as I or many others were. When she was apprehended, she went to the ground, and from what I understand, they interpreted resisting arrest on her part as I'm trying to protect my camera equipment from being broken. And as I'm sure you might be aware, she still has numbness in her hands as a result of the zip ties being applied as a response to her natural instinct to protect her working equipment. So.
Well, we're not really going to require Ed to be the spokesman for what, in my day, we would have called the entire establishment, but recognizing that the chaos in that first video presents somewhat of a very different circumstance than what you saw, where protesters were standing in a line, police were moving forward, there wasn't that noise, the drumming. Recognizing that, in those two videos, what would journalists have done better? What was an effect just doing their job? From your standpoint, what would you advise the working professionals in this room?
From the New York perspective, the journalists were certainly part of that story. They were right in part of the action. You were apparently retreating.
Yes.
You were trying to make it back to the
yes.
sidewalk, to the safety, protection of the sidewalk. And as yet, I think there's been no apology from the governor's office or the commissioner's
We've
office.
asked for it, but none forthcoming.
And so SPJ has requested an apology, have requested some training of THP, and that's not been forthcoming. In New York, it's been much more of a quote situation. And Deborah Fisher had mentioned, you know, y'all are going to be looking for what are best practices. You know, what should we be doing? And I don't know how you were dressed that night, for example, whether you were wearing.
Well, it was near Halloween, so I was wearing my protester costume.
Good,
so.
good. Well, I would suggest, if you can, always carry your press credentials. Carry some insignia on you. Wear a hat, wear a coat, you know, something that marks you. Carry a government-issued ID, so if nothing else, you can at least go vote in Tennessee. But you know, just make sure that you are easily recognizable.
Discussion for another day.
That's right. That's right.
Have we come to a point where, much like war correspondents now, you've got to wear that vest, maybe a helmet that says "Press La Prensa" in large letters, that it's impossible, or the authorities are unwilling to distinguish reporters by their conduct?
Well, I would think that's a bad idea. I mean, I think at first blush it seems almost like an overreaction to think that that would be required, but given the treatment of myself and many other journalists at this point covering the Occupy movement, I think some sort of just plainly visible form of identification that goes beyond. I mean, some of these journalists are credentialed, and
I think in the New York case, a number of those reporters who were arrested said they had New York City Police Department issued credentials around their neck.
Yeah.
Rob, is this a case of lessons learned 50 years ago around the civil rights movement, around the anti-war movement, where police moved to have a little to do what they would call surveillance or intelligence on who were the ringleaders, who were the protesters, who were the press? Are we back to an era of scoop them up and sort it out later?
Well, I think that law enforcement is not really trying to make a distinction between professional journalists and citizen journalists. And they don't really know how to do that, I guess, at this point. And they're just gonna grab everybody who and the law enforcement has a giant range of charges they can bring. You know, from, you heard on Jonathan's video, charge them with resisting arrest. But they can charge you with rioting, they can charge you with obstructing traffic, they can charge you with nearly anything, you know, that their minds can come up with.
But, you know, I've been trying to understand, because I'd say 95% of the arrests so far are with stringers who are in our trade really working almost full-time or regularly credentialed stringers, not the citizen blogger person, or full-time employees. And so we, you know, I think early on there was that concern of, oh, everybody's got a flip cam, you know, how will we distinguish? What's happening now in a list of arrests that go back all the way to September 26th in Boston are people working for weeklies, magazines, dailies, shooting video for television stations. People, I would think that either the media, I mean, the police know, you know, as often happens when you work a beat regularly, or at least are you know, you've got a camera on your shoulder. You're carrying a camera, you've got a notebook. By their conduct and their appearance, they seem to be identified. I'm puzzled as to why now and why with this protest. Is it just a lack of training?
Well, I think a lack of training is definitely part of that equation, but, you know, for decades you've had an increasing, I mean, as much as I want to, I don't have that much ill will toward the police after what happened, but I think you have to think of what they are trained to do. And this type of situation is something that they only encounter at like a sporting event or some sort of music, like large music venue, and where the rule of the day for them, I would imagine, is just crowd control, and they're applying those same types of tactics to a situation that the circumstances are a little more nebulous. You don't have journalists out, you know, covering Miley Cyrus concert being lit out, you know, like, so I think that they're not only not trained to deal with this, but what they are trained to do, I think, is coming up against that a little hard.
I'm curious, because I was talking to some folks just before the program began, and it seemed like everybody I had spoken with had at least one incident in which they had been thrown out or banned or moved away. How many people in the room have experienced that with a police action?
Wow.
Wow. Yeah, I recall in the early days of reporters challenging closed courtrooms, for example, where media attorneys, news operations provided reporters with a, you know, if you stand up, you know, the words to say are, Your Honor, I'm representing such and such, and, you know, we'd like time to consult. Are we at a point, or do you see media organizations starting to need to equipping reporters with what to say when the police come, or what to do when you're arrested?
I think we are. I think we need to make sure that when you're out in the field, that you have got the name of your, you know, senior news leader, and you've got the name of your lawyer, and you've got the name, you know, you've got $100 in your pocket maybe to bail out if the lawyer can't get there in time. We're probably at that point right now, and I hate to say that. In the situation that you're in, I don't know if when you showed up there that evening, if you had any suspicion or expectation that you might get picked up in this dragnet.
It was in the back of my head because of what I had read about other journalists covering this movement. I thought it was a possibility, but a remote one at that. But, you know, to amend your point, this is assuming that if these credentials and information is provided to police, that it will be received. In my experience, they had no interest whatsoever. So I think that it really does depend too much on law enforcement, which has a lot of leeway in situations like this.
And I think something also you see is that the federal agents are probably a little better trained than state and local agents, because they've got more statutes overlaid. There's a Privacy Protection Act from 1980 that imposes some requirements on federal agents that they are supposed to know about. And that applies in a few states. It doesn't apply in Tennessee, and so not everybody really has the training that they need to recognize, well, who's media, what can I do, and what are they allowed, where are they allowed to be.
When we talk about the right of journalists to be there to do their job, and I've written about the fact that the right to publish freely really requires the right to gather the news freely. But what are the rights of journalists, just on a strictly legal basis, to be somewhere and to be in Jonathan's circumstance where, while you're moving away, you're clearly somewhere that the general public is not.
Right. Well, you generally have a right to be in a public place, and you have a right to be where the public is allowed. But unfortunately, going back to the Brandsburg case from the early 70s, we don't have a greater right than the public. Some states have passed statutes that say that journalists have a right to be in places that the general public can't participate. Tennessee's not gone quite that far, and so, you know, we really just have to hope that law enforcement will give us a little bit greater leeway, that if we happen to be in a place involving a public commotion, that they'll at least recognize, well, we're in a different status than the people participating in the riot, and we ought to have a little bit more, you know, I hope a little more leeway.
I guess that in a way there's always been a formal, the legal, we have the rights of citizens, but an informal play between the joints where I'm here doing a job, I'm not necessarily protesting. Do you think you did anything, Jonathan, to indicate that you might be part of the protest?
I would say no, but I will grant, well, what the state has told me is that as I was making my retreat off Legislative Plaza, that I appeared to be joining the protesters. I could understand that, given that my trajectory was near them, but I was doing that in an attempt to film them. But generally, no, I don't think that I did anything to invite that, and when given an opportunity, if given an opportunity to redress that, it should have been, they should have acted differently, basically.
I'm just curious if I may. There was a time, I think everybody remembers, when it was a camera crew was 3 or 4 people, including somebody with a large boom. I mean, it's pretty hard to mistake. How big was, do you have the camera with you by any chance? How big was that camera?
It's probably a little bit bigger than like a pack of cigarettes. I mean, it's,
okay.
Like the dimensions are, it's very tiny, and it is, it's a consumer product. It's not like a giant news camera.
The size maybe?
Perfect, yeah.
You know, Android thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Well, and from what you were saying earlier, I'd say 80–90% of the people in the room have experienced being pushed out of a room, and nobody has had Mr. Siegenthaler's well-known experience down in Alabama with a flashlight against the back of the head. I mean, nobody wishes that for any journalist in the room. You know, and we have, luckily you weren't hurt, and your colleague from MTSU wasn't hurt, but it was that close.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me just quickly, waiting for Fred, review the arrest. It's a rather striking list. September 26th, the Boston Review, a reporter was maced. September 28th, Jonathan Farley from WNET 13 in New York, arrested. October 1st, the New York Times reporter and a digital reporter for an operation arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge. Jonathan on the 28th, I believe. No, it's fine. Thank you for coming in the midst of other duties. We've all been duly introduced, and we've shown a video, Jonathan's video from his arrest here in Nashville, but also a video from New York last night in which the chaotic circumstances there, where there was a lot of shouting, yelling, pushing, both by demonstrators and by police, when we could make out those points. One of the questions we've been discussing is this intersection between police who see a certain mission and journalists who are also there as an occupational circumstance. They're not there to protest. How can authorities recognize the informal, if you will, role of a journalist there, given that journalists have no more legal rights than others to be present? But clearly they have a job to do.
In thinking about this and looking at the coverage that you're talking about today out of New York, what occurs to me is that the 2 different times I've been a prosecutor, the thing that is most profound about that job is the discretion that you have. The decision to indict, the decision to investigate, particularly in the federal system, is so powerful that a lot of times it tends to overshadow the other decisions that you make on the day-to-day cases. Now, to a perhaps lesser extent in terms of its global impact, but to just as great an extent in terms of its impact on people, a law enforcement officer has discretion too. And he can go into that situation understanding that he's going to have to make some arrests, but also appreciating who's in the crowd and that there might be journalists there, there might be innocent bystanders, there might be passersby, family, all kinds of people who are not a part of this. And he has to exercise his good discretion in deciding how to treat each and every one of those people and not simply go in with a broad brush and start handcuffing people. And I think that's true of every situation, and it's magnified in a situation like this where you have valuable civil rights to protect. At the same time, you have a duty to protect the public and enforce the law. So my thinking is that it's discretion, and if you are able to identify the people who are not worthy of being arrested, you have a duty to avoid that if you can. Now, I'm not saying that you always can, and I realize being able to identify people means they've got to have some ID, they've got to be in the right place, and things like that. But as a general proposition, I say that a law enforcement officer needs to use good discretion in every situation.
One of the dilemmas for Jonathan, for the MTSU student who was arrested, and for some of the reporters in New York, particularly a few weeks ago, was that not only were they prevented at the moment, but they were held for hours at times, and processing in one way or another. And that really removed them from the reporting part. From a law enforcement standpoint, or a prosecutor standpoint, you're talking there about that initial judgment, you know, arrest him, or don't arrest her. What about at the entrance to the bus, where you, as I understand it here, the Tennessee State Police were processing people? When you arrive at maybe a holding area or a station, there, where, I mean, can that same discretion be exercised there? What can journalists do at those moments, or should they do at those moments, to also say, I've only been off the scene for half an hour or 45 minutes, rather than waiting for, you know, something 3 or 4 or 5 hours later?
Well, of course, you're getting very specific, and a lot of things can change without notice in those kinds of atmospheres. But I would say until you have made the charging decision and presented it to a magistrate or issued a citation, that all alternatives are in play, and that a conscientious officer would not want to make a mistake, understanding that he, in a high-profile situation like this, he's not only impacting an individual, he's going to have impact on the larger community and perhaps his own agency.
I'm thinking there in terms of best practices, so if you can't show your ID at the moment, you know, it's just not possible. As we saw in New York, it's chaotic. Maybe later, law enforcement perhaps should make allowances for that if somebody claims media, to look at, say, present your credential. Is that?
It seems like a reasonable approach, and again, there may be restrictions on that in particular cases.
Sure.
And I think that there will, and in Jonathan's case, you know, lessons learned is don't push, don't argue. If an arresting officer is making some demands on you that you think are unreasonable, cooperate as much as you can. Report, you know, get the person's badge number, report that person to your superior. You know, try to get your lawyer to make a demand later on. Do all that. And there's something I was asked a question in a newsroom seminar some years ago by a young lady who said, "What do I do in this situation?" I said, "There is nothing I can teach you about charm." So, you know, basically, if you're nice to the arresting officer, you're probably going to get a little bit broader latitude than you would otherwise. If you're, you know, screaming like the New York journalist was, he probably spent last night and tonight in jail.
The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, at every political convention, national political convention, develops a rather detailed set of instructions for journalists, including setting up hotlines and what have you. On a daily basis, I'm not sure that's possible, but what would each of you recommend that ought to be in, if you will, the arsenal or the preparedness kit, however you want to define it, for journalists who are they're covering an event and who run into those collisions with authorities when there's police action?
Well, I assume everyone has some kind of identification if they're a journalist. I remember a time when the Tennessee State Prison started requiring a lawyer to enter the prison to interview a client, that he have his bar card. And at the time that policy was instituted, most of us would get our bar card in the mail. We'd be sure that our dues were paid, and we'd throw it in the drawer. And so you could get all the way out here to the old prison and try to get behind the wall to talk to your appointed death penalty client and be turned away, because even though you knew the warden and he knew you, you didn't have the card. So you know, if such a thing exists, and I think it probably does.
How many have something that would be really identifiable locally? Interesting. State issued, employer issued? Okay. All right. Photo ID? Okay, so fair number.
From my perspective, I'd say stand where you can, record, photograph, film. When you're given a lawful order to retreat, retreat with the camera rolling. You know, if the officer wants to take your camera away, make him or her make that request, object and say that he or she doesn't have the right to make that request to take away your equipment, and just make them do their job. You remember the famous situation where Justice Scalia, speaking at a high school in Mississippi a couple years ago, I guess, and a couple of marshals took away recording equipment from a journalist, and they were required to give it back, and there was an apology involved, and it was such it didn't have to happen that way, but it was because people knew what the rights were, and they objected at the time, and they kept objecting after the recording devices were taken. So I think just keep doing your job as long as you can, and then I'm not sure in Jonathan's position, he was able to, the arresting officer gave you your recording equipment back. Have a colleague at the scene and hand off the recording equipment so that you can at least get the story on, and maybe you know, it's kind of like that Vanderbilt, you know, many 4 laterals in the last game. Just keep trying to do that and get your equipment off the arresting scene.
I have to note they didn't score.
They got called back. That's right.
But there was a good effort. Jonathan, you bright orange jumpsuit, helmet. What's up for you next?
Flak jacket.
Flak jacket.
A couple of flares. I think it seems as if we are assuming that law enforcement on the ground is acting as efficiently or by the letter as we would like them to. In my case, and that's really all I can really speak for, is they were not even wearing badges. Multiple attempts by myself and other journalists who were also threatened to identify myself and the other journalist. So I think that if law enforcement is not going to adhere to our hopes for them and what we assume that what behavior we assume that they should operate on, I think that all we're really left with is petitioning well after the fact, and that's better than nothing. But yeah, I would say flak jacket and maybe a hand buzzer when you go to shake their hand. I don't know. No, seriously, I just want to stress the point that if there is some sort of code or training in terms of dealing with journalists here in Tennessee and a lot of other places, in which there are, they did not appear to be operating off of that, and I think that's a big problem.
Well, about a month ago, in a settlement stemming from the last presidential election, 3 reporters who were arrested in St. Paul and Minneapolis during the convention there won, I think, a $100,000 settlement, but they also won a promise from the 2 police departments for media training, which apparently had not been done. Training on how to identify journalists, what was wrong with a sweep the streets policy. So again, I wonder if across the range, we're going, of course, from local to state to federal agencies, whether that training is now emphasized. Have you seen any of that?
No, and frankly, this type of thing seems to come in cycles, and we go for a long period of time without any demonstrations or civil disobedience, and law enforcement tends to forget that sort of thing can happen, and then all of a sudden it happens. I really think where you should look, I agree that the officers in the field oftentimes are not very alert to this, but the leadership should be alert. And the leadership has a duty to anticipate this type of thing once the demonstrators take to the street. And you know, I'm not criticizing anybody in particular in this instance, because I don't know enough to do that. But I would say that as a commissioner of safety or even a governor or mayor, once I see that a situation like this exists, I believe it's incumbent upon me to begin to discuss, are my men trained? Are you going to send in the right people, or are you just going to send in the regular folks who may not have a clue about how to handle this? And I think that's relevant.
Obviously, in this room, questions from the audience are particularly appropriate. So have at it if anybody has a question. Yeah.
Ed, before you got here, we've been talking about trends in law enforcement, and it seems like the trend has been more recently to kind of scoop everyone up and then sort it out later.
Yeah.
Do you think is that something that you've seen over the last 5, 10 years? How do you think this is kind of played out?
Well, there's some wisdom in that, believe it or not. And the wisdom is that you're not there to be a judge and a jury and make a lot of decisions about who's who, because if you start engaging in that, you may lose control of the situation. And so any law enforcement officer needs to quickly decide, can I do this? Can I separate the sheep from the goats, or do I just have to get everybody corralled and then sort it out later for public safety reasons? So there is legitimate function sometimes in just herding everybody to a different place. And so, it's like, I was at the infantry school in Fort Benning in 1969, and I noticed that every answer to every question, once it was all boiled down, was, it depends on the situation. And you get in a battle and you got all this great plan, and first shot's fired and you throw it out and do the best you can. And that's kind of the way it is in the street sometimes. And so I would say that, yeah, in a perfect world, yeah, you would figure out who's who and what's what, but a lot of these situations are very fluid and very violent, and you just don't have the opportunity to do that.
And the New York situation, I think, is just almost an atrocious example of what was going on, because you have people who are there simply to make a point with the media. He announced it at the very end, right. And the media participants are wrapped up in it. And from Ed's experience with federal court and federal prosecutions, I think those folks are generally well trained, and the federal government takes media rights very seriously. The federal government is not supposed to be issuing subpoenas to media organizations without DOJ approval from Washington, D.C., which is a terrific overlay to the entire process. But that doesn't exist for state and local government. And doing some reading up on it for tonight, I learned that there are some consent decrees in place, long-standing consent decrees in Chicago, New York, and some other places, that requires First Amendment training of law enforcement. Now, that doesn't exist here as far as I know, but I think it dates in Chicago maybe back to the '68 Democratic Convention. It may go back quite that far, and and now St. Paul has entered into this consent. They paid some money. They had very highly qualified lawyers who were prosecuting the case for the reporters, and God bless them. And in fact, I told Deborah I was a little surprised that Jonathan's going to be on this panel, because he's a prospective plaintiff, and here's a good lawyer. So there's all different kinds of ways for this to go.
We have a question back there.
This kind of bounces off what he was saying. Do you believe, and I noticed when the New York video came up, the headline of that online article talked about media blackout.
Yeah.
Do you feel like this is morphing into, like what you said, it could be officers that are not appropriately trained who are swooping in to do crowd control, or is there any potential for a malicious idea behind it to try to control the message and get us out of there to where we can't send coverage out?
Do I think there's malicious?
Right, I'm
Yeah.
saying when we start to see this video morph, like
Yeah.
what we're seeing out of New York.
Certainly there can always be malicious intent, but in almost every situation like this I've ever seen, and I've seen a few in my many years, not as many as John, but almost, it's almost always poor preparation, poor training, lack of training, and just buffoonery. If I'm permitted, I'd like to tell a story that might fit that a little bit. One of my best friends is Randall Wyatt, who's been a criminal court judge here for many years, and before that a general sessions judge. But when he first came to Nashville, he came out of the FBI in Detroit, and his first job in Nashville was legal advisor for the Nashville Police Department in 1971. And there were still demonstrations going on in Centennial Park about the war at that time. And one day, Chief Mott, who was police chief at the time, and I believe Mayor Briley, decided he'd had enough of it. And that's what happens. People, they'll go along with it a while, and then eventually they just say, well, get them out of there. And so they went out and arrested about 40 people at Centennial Park for loitering. And a young enterprising reporter from the Nashville Tennessean named Albert Gore Jr. went downtown and interviewed the brand new police legal advisor, Randall Wyatt. and said, "What did you think about that, Mr. White?" And he said, "Loitering? Well, that's what you do in a park." He wrote that down quickly, said, "Thank you," and left.
There you go.
And the next morning, headlines, the Tennessean police legal advisor disagrees with arrests in the park. Of course, it was a little icy at the headquarters for a few days, but he was very popular down at 1100 Broad and a lot of those places. And of course, those cases had to be thrown out because you can't really use laws like that just willy-nilly when you want to. You have to have the appropriate law in the appropriate circumstance. But that wasn't malicious. That was just public officials getting a little impatient and moving forward when they weren't ready to.
Wish Al had been that quick when he was running for president.
Exactly.
I have to say, though, that some of the reports out of the New York situation were that even to the extent that police helicopters were hovering over a multi-block area, preventing news helicopters from covering it from effectively from above, which indicates a little bit of degree of planning to have those things positioned there. Also, what seems to be occurring too more and more is your collision was at the scene. Most of these people who were arrested were at the scene. But now in the last week, we've begun to see cordons, multi-block areas where reporters aren't allowed. A number of reporters for New York news organizations filed a protest, and I believe the Deadline Club, which is the SPJ presence in New York City, filed a complaint today saying, not just at the moment, not just at the point of the tip of the spear, if you will, but blocks away, being restrained from coming into coverage. And that seems to raise the circumstances of restraint of the coverage by the press to a new level.
And are they excluding reporters only and letting the public go through?
No, they're excluding citizens, but they're, and, you know, how many people go through a police tape or a police scene? You know, I noticed this morning video from a lot of folks on a crash out in Bellevue area. At least one station, I think 5 had, or 2 had a reporter on this, you know, literally on the lane, you know, shooting the scene. Obviously, the public wasn't permitted, unless I guess you were stuck in the situation. But clearly, that reporter was allowed to pull up and take a picture. Again, recognition of the conduct of a journalist, maybe not that legal, but that informal recognition of a role to play. Does that seem excessive to begin to do these cordons?
Freedom zones, they're nothing new, but to sort of piggyback on the previous question this gentleman asked, I don't think there's anything necessarily malicious about that, but some degree of planning in terms of grounding helicopters and cordoning off journalists. I don't think it's malicious. I think it's just sort of an inevitable byproduct of the municipalities and that are in charge of these areas where Occupy protests are happening. It's a political element. I believe that there's a PR angle to this, to where one camera can capture one event, and it can cause an Occupy movement that, if ignored, would fade away. It can cause it to metastasize, and I don't think that it's planned, but when you have law enforcement that is, you know, it's essentially a paramilitary force these days in America, to be deployed in you know, as far as Oakland with Scott Olson, if these horrific images of police brutality or misconduct can be controlled or swept away, then it serves the interests of you know, of government in a way that I think comes at a cost to, you know, access freedom zones.
We've done any number of programs here about civil rights, the movement in the 50s and 60s, and they're very open about including media coverage as a way to touch the nation with a message that wouldn't have otherwise been told. We have a question back over here.
This may be for you some too. I'm interested in the development of citizen journalism and people who are out documenting events, and I'm interested in kind of where that falls in terms of the press, as mentioned, and also the eyes of the law.
The question is, in terms of the development of citizen journalists, where do they fall in this whole structure and to some degree in this collision? Well, you know, the First Amendment, 45 words, of course, make no qualification that you be employed, have a press card, have a lawyer. You are a journalist if you say you are. And that probably is the chant of citizen journalists. When we look at the definition issue, some people don't want a press card issued by the state because that's in effect a license, you know, issue it, take it away. I think maybe the guidance here is to look at what's going on around the SHIELD law effort on the federal level. And maybe if we can talk, if there's some history in Tennessee about the development of the law here. What they really arrived at was a conduct or behavior or intent. If your goal is to inform, take information and inform the public, you are covered by that SHIELD law. Now that's imperfect. You know, the Obama administration on the federal level argued, well, everybody's going to say they have that intent. But I think being there for a publication or being there for a blog that's established, or just having the tools of news gathering may help you define yourself as a journalist, your conduct at the scene. If you're standing there holding arms with a protester, chanting along with them, it's going to be very difficult to drop back and say you were there as a journalist, although again, the First Amendment really doesn't rule out advocacy journalism. So it's going to be another point of collision and confusion to some degree because, you know, the old days of the snap brim hat with the press card in it meant you are one, doesn't apply now. So it's in one sense in the First Amendment it's very clear. You are functioning as a journalist, you are to me part of the free press. But in the joints is where the issue is going to get some play.
That's a great way of putting it. I appreciate and endorse Gene's broad view of journalism because I would like to see citizen journalists, you know, totally incorporated within the whole scope of the SHIELD law. And Tennessee is, we haven't quite decided where we are, but we're edging that way. Bloggers are, you know, creeping into the Tennessee SHIELD law, and I think that they should. The Tennessee Rule 30 about media coverage in courts is not quite as broad. I mean, it's going to require legitimate media and cameras in courts and all that, and we all recognize what that means. But I think we're, you know, those issues are on us. Some states recognize more protections for journalists than Tennessee does, but just in practice, we've got a pretty vibrant protection for journalists around here, and I'm glad that we did it.
How would you define a journalist if you needed to come up with that legal definition? And Jonathan, the same question.
Well, I think if you declare yourself a journalist, you probably are one. But, you know, if you're going to be one, you need to behave like one. Like you said, if you're part of the demonstration and you're doing something that maybe a journalist doesn't normally do, you need to be aware of that, and you may subject yourself to do a role. You know, and a journalist who is also a demonstrator can be arrested if he violates the law. And it's not necessarily his First Amendment rights that are being affected, it's his violation of the law and the need to enforce that law that requires his incarceration. I remember a time in Memphis when I was editing a college newspaper, and some of us almost got arrested trying to integrate a restaurant just a few blocks from the campus, and we all ran in fear at the very appearance of a police officer. But we would have considered ourselves journalists, and I'm sure, you know, if we had enough sense to, made the argument that we were if something bad had happened. But I think you can be a journalist nowadays if you've got a computer or a cell phone.
Sure.
Yeah, I would largely agree to that. I think that with communications technology, if you say you're a journalist and you spread whatever information you've gathered via Facebook or Twitter, you've technically informed people in a journalistic fashion. So I don't think that it requires a fedora with a hat. And I mean, that's if you are passing along information, if you keep it to yourself, then probably not. But no, I would say that the very porous boundaries in terms of what defines journalism.
You have no idea how comforting it is for me that you use the word fedora. I don't feel quite
I'm
so
a big
old.
Indiana Jones fan.
Another question up here.
You know how the First Amendment doesn't differentiate between journalists and everybody else who's protected under it. I thought I heard some allusion to places where there's legal consideration of are you a journalist or not. Maybe I misheard that earlier in the talk. Are there any places where a reporter has more to stand on than the goodwill of an officer and, you know, the power of the press? And if you're arrested and what's called, are there any ways where parts of law have been carved out? And what are the merits or demerits of that?
The question is, in effect, we've been talking about journalists having no more rights than citizens, but are there circumstances, or have we referred to circumstances where, in effect, they do have more rights than the average?
There are a few states that pass laws that say that journalists have greater right to be at a crime scene, for example, or a scene of a public protest. But we're not one. And I don't see any great move afoot in this General Assembly for us to get there.
So cynical.
You agree? I want to ask a question though, because, and maybe
Larry Brenton used to greet the police when they arrived at the scene.
That's true, you get there early.
Yeah, that's right.
You control the seat, high ground.
Yeah, a question I needed to pose is, what happens when the law enforcement decides that we're the ones who are instigating the riot? I mean, you look in New York, where there is some acting out or public performance going on for the cameras. So, you know, I don't believe that that's going to subject us to a charge, but I wonder whether the law enforcement is going to use that as an opportunity to move us away, you know, give us farther away from the speaking zone.
Well, some of the best practices that I've seen, and in fact, some of the advice for being in a combat zone, if you will, or if you think about the Arab Spring, where it's potential for great violence, but it's a demonstration, at least in name, often talk about the necessity not to use that bright light, or not to distinguish yourself by clothing, ironically, that's different from, that makes you stand out, because of the potential for demonstrators to put the media in the middle and use that as a sort of gathering or a catalyst. So again, there's great advice. Stand out, identify yourself. On the other hand, don't stand out, don't identify yourself.
It all depends.
But as you said, it all depends. But hopefully we haven't reached that level of violence yet here, where it's inappropriate to not distinguish yourself by conduct or appearance. But I'm not sure what. That's an individual decision, and again, probably an individual circumstance. One of the things that distinguished Nashville from New York, as we've seen in the videos anyway, was that there didn't seem to be a violent confrontation going on. This was at most a silent protest or a nonviolent protest. And maybe the rules are different there in terms of what you do as a journalist?
I think they should be, because that's the rule of law generally, that you only meet force with reasonable reactive force. It's the law of self-defense. You can defend yourself with reasonable, even weaponry perhaps, but if someone is 20 feet away with a knife, you can't shoot them. If they're coming close, then it becomes a question of fact for a jury as to whether you were threatened with immediate bodily harm, and then you can use deadly force, but only then. And so if you transfer that to this situation, if you have a silent and largely orderly protest, I think you might have to take the position that violence in the removal of those people is unreasonable.
I'd only point out that gun-knife distinction is a relatively new case in Tennessee. Not that many years ago, I think only 20 or 30 years ago in Memphis, was that arbitrary use of violence.
Brought a knife to a gunfight.
Right, that's it. So just a heads up on that. That's not that long a tradition in our state that you don't take a gun to a knife fight. When we're looking at people here working on the street in the profession, is it, and I want to say this in the right way, is it a good idea to get to know people on the beat? I mean, we used to, when we all had real beat structures, where you were there every day in the cop house, or you were there every day in the courthouse. That's different, but I mean, should there be a here's what we do session at the THP Training Academy? I mean, is that realistically going to be effective, or is it just one of those great ideas that is going to work in practice?
It couldn't hurt. I mean, familiarity with law enforcement, between law enforcement and journalists, I don't see any downside to that. If anything, I think that there is too little contact, and whenever there is, it seems to be adversarial in terms of stories written about law enforcement. But yeah, I can't think of any.
Well, that question hits a nerve with me, because I came up in the day when the Tennessean and the Banner had an office in the courthouse, and they had Ken Jost and John McLemore, and then later Kirk Loggins served for many years down there as the court reporter. And because they hung out with us and knew us, and when I say us, I mean prosecutors and defense lawyers, they got a lot more stuff
Yeah.
than they ever got with this arm's length stuff that we
Yeah.
have now. That's, you know, that's a sensitive subject for me, because I'm really appalled nowadays at what passes for news gathering. And the reason the news is not gathered is that the news makers don't know the reporters. And, you know, a lot of times newsmakers are hams, you know, they're egotistical. They want you to know about their big case. But they're not gonna call a stranger and tell him, because they don't think they can trust them. But if they've had lunch with him and they've seen him in the hall and they've waited for juries with him until midnight and all that kind of stuff that we used to do, boy, we would tell a reporter almost anything. And a lot of good news got reported that way.
And I think it'd be a great yoke for SPJ. I mean, Ed and I know will take the chance to go give speeches to judges. I mean, I've spoken to judge conferences before to say, you know, we're with the media, we're the good guys, and, you know, when you get a closure motion, here are all the steps you have to go through, because some don't know what they are, and some don't recognize the differences between camera issues or closure issues or all of that. But I mean, it could be something that SPJ wants to take on to say to THP or to say to the Metro Police. We'd love to give some free education to you all about who we are and what we do. And you know, if you have a public protest, maybe you know, before you arrest everybody, maybe you move the media. So everybody here who's with the media, move over to one side. Now, you might have had the entire Legislative Plaza move over to that one side. I don't know. They could have all become citizen journalists right then. But at the same time, you know, it could have saved us all a lot of time and money.
Yeah. Well, I also wonder if a couple of porta potties might not have prevented a constitutional collision. But that's another discussion as well.
Pragmatic approach.
Yeah, we have a question here. I think that may have to be our last one.
Legislative Plaza for me is an interesting situation because it's kind of up on a kind of a rise there. And as a journalist, to see what's going on, to see the demonstrations and to see the arrests, the demonstrators picked a very dark central spot of the plaza in which if you were not on the plaza, you would not see what's going on. So as a journalist, we have to go up on the plaza and be in that area, which is part of this curfew or this mandate. Do we have, as journalists, a reasonable expectation to walk up the steps and at least get in a reasonable proximity to the arrest to see what's going on? And, I mean, obviously, if you got there to see what was going on, you would be in violation of this curfew.
Well, there's actually some constitutional law that sort of touches your point, and that is this. There are some places that, because of their political significance and their you know, demonstrative significance, whatever, you have extra privilege to demonstrate there. Let's say that you're protesting something the governor has done. I think this case law supports the idea that you can get at least in proximity of the governor's office, a public place, in order to state your case. He can't say, oh, you're free to demonstrate against me, but I want you to do it on Sidco Drive or whatever. That's not a constitutionally reasonable restriction. So you may have something there. If you can't cover the story from below, then you may have a right to be up there. But on the other hand, you don't necessarily have a right to be in the middle of a mess, of Baylor.
Yeah. There's a 1939 case, Hague versus Congress of Industrial Organization, which sets out the doctrine of public forum also, which says that there are certain places, just by their nature, public parks, streets, and things, which are special zones for public protests in which the public has a sort of extra right to be there to protest. And again, while we have no more rights than the public, we also have no less rights than the public, I think, in that instance.
And if all the protesters are gathered in a place where they're trespassing, you probably don't have the right to trespass with them. But you get on a public spot and broadcast them as much as you can.
That's when you call your helicopter.
Okay, we have a dispensation for one more question then.
This isn't really a question, but
I
just wanted to say that if we ever needed a more dramatic demonstration of the need for a society for professional journalists, I don't know what it is. I mean, I know all of us at the scene were, the scene is not known for humility or sincerity, but I know that all of us were really humbled and touched by how other media responded to the coverage. And having the combined weight of the SPJ behind that coverage and the force of the letter that they sent on behalf of working journalists was immensely supportive and helpful.
No better perhaps segue than to the chapter president of it.
Thank you for this great very much. And thank you for that great segue, because I was going to put in a plug for SPJ at the end. As I said, we restarted the chapter. It was going, but we really kicked off kind of a re-energized chapter in September. This was important to us to put together this group and to stand up for what we did. And I think Rob makes a good point. I think there's still work to do, where we need to reach out, to continue to try to reach out to the safety department, as well as, you know, in different areas. Of course, there are a lot of chapters that do things like that and have law day and all that. And I think that we need to continue to look for ways to get that dialogue going, because what we don't want, and I don't think the Tennessee governor and officials in charge want, are for journalists to be arrested. None of us want that. We want to be able to report on things that are going on. We feel like that's our responsibility, to shine a light, to bear witness on things that are going on in our community. I think we have common ground there, and I think that's where we should start from. So thank you all so much for coming. We're going to have some final words from John Siegenthaler. So come on up, also an
Thank you very
SPJ
much.
member.
I just take a minute to thank you all for coming, and to thank Gene and Ed, Jonathan. And I'd like to say a special word of thanks to Jonathan for the courage he demonstrated, for the good judgment he demonstrated, for the restraint he demonstrated. You can't look at his tape and not have a sense that this is a professional journalist. Ken Paulson and Ken sitting in the back, silently observing, but Ken and I, for more than 10 years, did a program together in which he would always say, there is no freedom that does not have limitations. Yes, First Amendment rights are broad, but obscenity is not covered, and slander and libel are not covered. Yes, we have a Second Amendment right to carry a gun, but you can't go on a school ground with a pistol. There are limits to what every one of those freedoms entails. I have just a couple of quick thoughts as I listen to what was real wisdom from that stage tonight. The new media has changed the dynamic for all of us, and you heard it as it is. In this new world, anybody who says he's a journalist can be a journalist. I guess it was always that way, but when everybody has the tools at fingertip to communicate with people across the country, around the world, it takes on new meaning. So anybody who wants to be a journalist can be a journalist. But from what you've heard tonight and what you know about who you are, there is something called a professional journalist. You know, maybe journalism is not a profession, but to be a professional journalist means that aside from being just anybody who has access to a computer, there are values and there are standards, and they have to do with accuracy, and they have to do with balance, and they have to do with fairness, and they have to do with serving a public that needs information delivered just in that way. I'm so glad that, Gene, that we joined with Deborah tonight and joined with the Society of Professional Journalists, because it gives us a chance one more time, to recognize a fellow who, under great pressure, under great threat, demonstrated professionalism. We've had a chance to hear from two lawyers who have set out the standards and have said, yes, anybody is, but you in particular are. And so, while those of us who are journalists so often forget that everybody in society has different rights. Right of free speech, right of petition, right of assembly, they belong to everybody. The right of free press belongs to everybody. But the responsibility of a professional journalist is unique. And if we who are professional journalists profess to be and who are, if we maintain adherence to those old values, then what you've heard tonight will make great meaning, and I think the society will be a lot better off. Thank you all for coming. Come whenever you can. This is a home away from home for professional journalists. Thanks.